When the winter sky stretched pale and streaked over northern Germany, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler guided his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into formation behind what he assumed was routine prey. Another American fighter limping home, low on fuel, alone, and easy to finish. For months, German interceptors had been carving apart Allied escorts forced to stretch their range beyond safe limits. To Stigler, this looked like nothing more than another predictable kill until he got closer. As Stigler eased forward, the silhouette ahead puzzled him. It didn't resemble the chunky P-47 Thunderbolt nor the dual-boom P-38 Lightning he was used to chasing. This aircraft's lines were sleeker, sharper, almost predatory. He had glanced at brief intelligence notes about this new type, but German analysts had written it off as unimpressive. A North American P-51 Mustang, supposedly nothing special. Yet something in its stance, even damaged, felt different. What Stigler didn't realize, what German high command hadn't fully grasped, was that this unassuming fighter would soon unravel the Luftwaffe's dominance. The aircraft in his gun sight was not the underpowered machine the Germans believed it to be. It was a transformed weapon, one that in the months ahead would alter the entire balance of air power over Europe. Within weeks of this encounter, waves of these new Mustangs, around 175 of them, would appear over Berlin, escorting American bombers on missions military planners had once considered physically impossible. These fighters would fly farther, higher, and longer than any escort before them. They would overturn equations, strategies, and assumptions that had defined aerial warfare for years. This is the beginning of a story that stretches from misunderstood prototype to war-shaping legend. It is the story of how an aircraft dismissed as a low-altitude side note became the blade that sliced through the Luftwaffe's defensive shield. And at the center of that transformation lies a single, crucial change, an innovation that unlocked abilities no one believed possible. But Stigler didn't know any of this as he closed in. All he saw was a lone fighter, one that looked strangely resilient, strangely capable. In just a few months, encounters like this one would no longer be surprises. They would be warnings. So what went wrong with the early Mustang, and how did one radical decision transform it from a struggling low-altitude machine into the long-range escort that shattered Germany's air strategy? The answer begins long before Berlin ever saw a Mustang's shadow. To understand why the Mustang's transformation mattered so profoundly, you first have to understand the disaster unfolding for American bomber crews in late 1943. The United States Army Air Forces had embraced a bold, almost audacious belief that Nazi Germany could be defeated not by destroying armies in the field, but by smashing the industrial engine that kept those armies moving. Strategic bombing was their chosen weapon, a method that aimed not at trenches, but at factories, fuel plants, and transportation lifelines. American doctrine contrasted sharply with Germany's. The Luftwaffe had made its name through tactical air power, fighters and dive bombers acting like airborne artillery, striking right where ground forces needed support. But the Americans believed victory could come from the sky alone. If they could cripple production deep inside the Reich, they could force the war's end. There was just one fatal flaw in this strategy: getting to those targets alive. To reach factories in central Germany, American bombers had to fly through hundreds of miles of hostile airspace. The Luftwaffe had built an aerial trap across occupied Europe, radar stations, fighter bases, flak batteries, and coordinated interceptor wings. Every mile deeper into Germany meant more pressure, more danger, more losses. The fighters meant to protect the bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, simply couldn't keep up. Their range wasn't enough. They accompanied bombers only partway before turning back to refuel, leaving the formations alone in what crews ominously named the Death Gap. Inside this zone, German fighters attacked relentlessly, sometimes in waves so dense that bomber gunners couldn't fire fast enough to keep up. The numbers were terrifying. On missions to heavily defended industrial cities like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, losses sometimes reached 20% or more. That meant 1 out of every 5 bombers never came home. Dozens of aircraft, each with 10 men aboard, vanished from the sky in a single day. It didn't take advanced mathematics to realize that crews were unlikely to survive their required 25-mission tour. Something had to change, and fast. The American strategy was collapsing, not because the bombers were weak, but because they couldn't survive long enough to deliver their payloads. What the Air Forces desperately needed was a fighter that could fly the entire distance with them. A fighter that could battle German interceptors at 20,000 feet and still have the fuel to get home. But the fighter America needed didn't exist, or so the engineers believed. Why? Because physics itself seemed to forbid a machine that could fly far, fight high, and still maneuver like a true dogfighter. Until, unexpectedly, a forgotten prototype offered a glimmer of hope. The strange truth about the Mustang is that when it first appeared, nobody thought it would become the savior of the bomber force. In 1941, when North American aviation rolled out the P-51 prototypes, the U.S. Army Air Forces didn't even rush to buy them. Early tests showed promise, but nothing groundbreaking. The design seemed sleek, the aerodynamics efficient, but not enough to redefine aerial combat. In fact, the only reason the U.S. kept a handful of Mustangs was because General Henry Hap Arnold personally intervened. Instead of letting the British take the entire order, he insisted on keeping 55 airframes for evaluation. Even then, these planes weren't placed into frontline fighter groups. They were treated like curiosities, potentially useful but not essential. Most early Mustangs weren't even used as fighters. The Army Air Forces converted them into F-6A reconnaissance planes and sent them to North Africa. Their job? Take photos, not dogfight. The high command simply didn't believe the Mustang was the answer to their deep-range escort crisis. The reason for this disappointment was simple: the engine. The first P-51A models used the Allison V1710 engine, the same powerplant in P-40 Warhawks and early P-38s. That engine was reliable at low altitudes, even excellent near the ground, but above 15,000 feet, it struggled badly. By 20,000 feet, where American bombers fought for their lives, the Mustang became sluggish and lost power dramatically. So the Mustang was shipped off to theaters where the air war happened closer to the ground. The China-Burma-India theater received most of the early production run, and pilots there appreciated the aircraft's precision in fighter-bomber roles. It was stable, responsive, and tough, but it wasn't rewriting history. In 1943, the Army even ordered a new ground attack version called the A-36 Apache. It had dive brakes, bomb racks, and was used for precision strikes across Italy, North Africa, and India. Pilots respected it, commanders valued it, but nobody saw it as the future of the air war. At best, it was another dependable workhorse, nothing more. What no one realized was that the Mustang's airframe, its aerodynamic purity, its low drag, its efficient laminar flow wing, held a hidden potential waiting to be unlocked. All it needed was the right heart beating inside it. But who would be bold enough to attempt the impossible, replacing the Mustang's entire power plant? And how did one British engine turn a mediocre fighter into the most feared aircraft over Europe? The breakthrough was coming, and it would change everything. Sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come from seeing an old problem with new eyes. By late 1942, engineers on both sides of the Atlantic had begun wondering the same thing. What if the Mustang's airframe wasn't the issue at all? What if the real limitation was the engine under its cowling? The Allison simply couldn't breathe at high altitude, but the Mustang's aerodynamic design was begging for more power. Across the ocean, Britain had already solved the high-altitude engine puzzle. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, legendary for powering the Supermarine Spitfire, was a marvel of precision engineering. Unlike the Allison, the Merlin's two-stage supercharger kept the engine strong even at 25,000 to 30,000 feet. It didn't lose power where it mattered most. It thrived. And somewhere, history still debates exactly who first suggested it. A radical idea took root. What if the British Merlin engine were fitted to the American Mustang? On paper, it sounded like a nightmare. New mounts, new cooling systems, a different propeller, weight changes, airflow rebalancing. Nearly everything would need to be rebuilt from scratch. But the potential payoff was too massive to ignore. When the first test aircraft took off with the Merlin engine installed, even seasoned pilots were stunned. The numbers were unbelievable. A prototype in the U.S. reached roughly 441 miles per hour near 30,000 feet, almost 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison-powered version at that altitude. The Mustang was suddenly fast, powerful, and eager to climb. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was a metamorphosis. Engineers realized instantly that they had created a fighter with extraordinary range, dazzling speed, and lethal altitude performance. The Merlin didn't just improve the Mustang. It unlocked the aircraft's true identity. The Mustang was no longer a low-altitude specialist. It was now the long-range escort fighter the U.S. desperately needed, one that could finally stand between bomber crews and annihilation. Production shifted almost overnight. The P-51B and P-51C variants, built in California and Texas, became the first true combat-ready Merlin-powered Mustangs. Engineers refined cooling ducts, repositioned fuel tanks, strengthened internal structures, and optimized dozens of small systems. The result was a fighter that was more than the sum of its parts. It was a machine designed to break the Luftwaffe's grip on Europe. By late 1943, these new Mustangs began arriving in England. Pilots felt it immediately. This wasn't just another fighter. It was a weapon designed for a new kind of war, one that Germany wasn't prepared to face. But how did these new Mustangs perform when they finally met the Luftwaffe over Germany? And what happened during the first escort missions that shocked German commanders? The sky over Europe was about to erupt. By early 1944, the newly transformed P-51B and P-51C Mustangs were ready for the mission they had been created for, escorting American bombers deep into Germany, far beyond where any Allied fighter had ever protected them before. Their arrival coincided with the launch of Operation Point Blank, the Allied plan to cripple Germany's war industries and force the Luftwaffe into a battle it couldn't avoid. Until now, German fighter pilots had been able to predict exactly when American escorts would turn back. They knew the fuel limits. They knew the timing. When the thunderbolts and lightnings peeled away, the Luftwaffe descended like hawks on cornered prey. But when the Mustangs arrived, that clockwork advantage disappeared overnight. On March 6, 1944, the shift became undeniable. That morning, for the first time in the war, American bombers struck Berlin with full fighter escort coverage. Not halfway, not most of the way, but all the way to the target and all the way home. Roughly 175 P-51 Mustangs stretched across the bomber stream like an armored shield. German pilots scrambled to intercept as they always had, expecting the usual unguarded bombers. Instead, they found Mustangs diving toward them from above, from the sides, from angles the Luftwaffe wasn't used to defending against. The shock was immediate. Their prey now had fangs. The Mustangs weren't tethered to the bomber boxes like older escorts. They had orders to roam ahead, sweep the skies, and dismantle German formations before they could organize. This new tactic turned defensive escort duty into an offensive hunt. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe's interceptors found themselves isolated, outnumbered, and unable to break through. For German squadron leaders, the psychological blow was devastating. Their long-held certainty that American bombers would eventually be left unprotected was gone. Mustangs chased retreating fighters back toward their own airfields, something unthinkable months earlier. Even veteran Luftwaffe aces described these new escorts as ghosts that refused to turn back. This single day marked a turning point. The Luftwaffe wasn't just fighting a new aircraft. It was fighting a new strategy, one specifically designed to grind it down. The hunters had truly become the hunted. But the Mustang's evolution wasn't finished. A new variant was about to arrive, one with greater firepower, better visibility, and innovations that made it the definitive version of the war. The P-51D was coming, and it would dominate the skies like nothing before it. Even as the P-51B and P-51C were proving themselves as the new kings of high-altitude escort duty, North American aviation was already preparing the next evolution of the Mustang. Combat feedback poured in from pilots over Europe, notes about visibility, firepower, fuel distribution, and cockpit ergonomics. Engineers listened, refined, redesigned. The result of that process would become the most iconic Mustang variant ever built, the P-51D. The first thing pilots noticed was the canopy. Earlier Mustangs used a razorback design, with a tall spine that blocked rearward visibility. The new bubble canopy eliminated that blind spot entirely. Pilots could now see in every direction, up, down, and behind. In aerial combat, where a few seconds of warning could determine life or death, this change was revolutionary. The bubble canopy became the signature silhouette of the Mustang. But visibility wasn't the only improvement. The P-51D also carried a heavier punch. Earlier B and C models mounted 4.50 caliber machine guns, effective but sometimes prone to jamming. The P-51D increased the armament to 6 Browning M2.50 caliber guns with a redesigned ammunition feed system that dramatically improved reliability. Now, when pilots squeezed the trigger, the full firepower of all 6 guns struck with devastating consistency. These weapons were not ordinary machine guns. The .50 caliber M2 fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds capable of ripping through the aluminum frames of German fighters and detonating fuel tanks in seconds. A 1-second burst from a P-51D could shred an aircraft into fragments. German pilots quickly learned to respect and fear the Mustang's broadside. Then came one of the Mustang's most underrated upgrades, the K-14 gyroscopic gunsight. Instead of forcing pilots to calculate lead angles manually, the gunsight did it for them, automatically adjusting the reticle based on the target's distance and movement. Suddenly, even average pilots could deliver killing shots with surprising accuracy. Nearly 8,000 P-51D Mustangs rolled off the production lines, making it the most common and most celebrated version. By the spring of 1944, just as the Allies prepared for the Normandy invasion, entire fighter groups transitioned to the P-51D, giving the U.S. Army Air Forces the most capable long-range escort fleet in military aviation history. When these new Mustangs entered combat, the Luftwaffe realized the nightmare had only deepened. The P-51D could see better, hit harder, and stay longer than anything the Germans could field in response. But how did the Mustang's arrival translate into real numbers? And what did it do to the Luftwaffe's veteran pilot force, the heart of Germany's air strategy? The true impact was about to reveal itself in brutal statistics. By the beginning of 1944, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. For years, German pilots had enjoyed tactical dominance, choosing when to strike, where to intercept, and how to overwhelm isolated bomber formations. But the arrival of long-range Mustangs changed the rhythm of the air war. Bit by bit, mission by mission, the Luftwaffe found itself bleeding pilots and aircraft faster than it could replace them. The shift showed up almost instantly in mission reports. In January 1944, before the Mustang escorts reached full strength, the 8th Air Force lost more than 200 heavy bombers in operations over Germany. But as Mustang numbers grew, losses began to fall, even as the bombing campaign intensified against heavily defended industrial hubs. By May 1944, bomber losses dropped to 156, despite more missions and heavier opposition. The difference was unmistakable. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was trapped in a fight it could not win. Every time German fighters tried to attack the bomber stream, they were swarmed by Mustangs approaching from above, behind, or straight into their formation. Veteran American pilots described it as a trap that followed the enemy wherever they flew. But for German aircrews, it felt like drowning in a sea of silver wings. The consequences were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe wasn't losing just aircraft. It was losing its most experienced pilots. Men who had survived years of combat in Spain, Poland, France, and Russia were now being shot down by the dozens. These were aces with hundreds of sorties, and once they were gone, Germany had no equivalent replacements waiting in training schools. Worse for the Luftwaffe, fuel shortages and rushed training programs meant replacements often had fewer than 100 flying hours before entering combat. Many had never fired their guns in real dogfights. Facing Mustangs flown by seasoned U.S. pilots, they stood little chance. Entire squadrons were wiped out in a single week. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter force was collapsing. They still launched intercepts when bombers approached, but these attacks were increasingly desperate. Aircraft were outdated, engines were unreliable, pilots were inexperienced, and fuel was so scarce that some squadrons could barely train at all. The outcome of each battle felt predetermined. The Mustang hadn't just beaten the Luftwaffe. It had broken the backbone of Germany's air defense structure. And it wasn't finished yet. The next phase of the air war would show just how aggressively the Allies intended to use their new weapon. With German air defenses crumbling, Mustang pilots shifted tactics, from defending bombers to hunting the Luftwaffe wherever it hid. Airfields, rail lines, and even training schools became targets. What happened next was a systematic dismantling of Germany's ability to wage war from the sky. Once the Luftwaffe began to buckle under relentless losses, the role of the Mustang shifted. No longer were P-51 pilots confined to circling the bomber formations. With air superiority tipping in the Allies' favor, commanders unleashed a new and aggressive strategy. Seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it existed. This meant taking the fight not only to the skies but to the ground, hitting German air power at its roots. Mustang squadrons began sweeping far ahead of bomber streams, patrolling air corridors long before the bombers arrived. These fighter sweeps were designed to disrupt, scatter, and intimidate German interceptors before they could even assemble. Many Luftwaffe units were caught in the middle of takeoff or forming up when Mustangs struck from above. Surprise became the Mustang's deadliest ally. But the most devastating tactic came in the form of low-altitude strafing runs. Once considered too dangerous to attempt regularly, these missions became standard practice. Mustangs flew at treetop height, sweeping across German airfields, destroying aircraft before they ever left the ground. Hangars, fuel depots, parked fighters, nothing was safe. Pilots later described these missions as controlled chaos. At such low altitudes, one mistake could be fatal. Trees, antenna masts, flak cannons, and even camouflage netting posed deadly hazards. But the results were staggering. Mustang squadrons wiped out entire Luftwaffe units in a single pass, burning through aircraft that Germany no longer had the resources to replace. The strikes didn't stop at airfields. Mustangs targeted rail yards, convoys, communication lines, and fuel trains, paralyzing the infrastructure that supported German air power. Every destroyed tanker car or railway junction meant fewer operational fighters in the sky. German pilot training programs also became victims of Mustang dominance. Rookie pilots, already undertrained, were forced into the air knowing Mustangs might be waiting above. Some were shot down minutes into their first real missions. The Luftwaffe's most precious resource, time to train new aviators, simply evaporated. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer an organized fighting force. It was a patchwork of scattered units, isolated pockets, and makeshift squadrons desperately trying to resist. The Mustangs, meanwhile, roamed freely over Germany, striking targets at will and escorting bombers with near impunity. The Allies had taken control of the sky so completely that German defenses on the ground and in the air were reduced to fragments of their former power. And through it all, the Mustang stood at the center of this historic shift, fast, relentless, and always overhead. But just how decisive was the Mustang's impact? And what legacy did it leave behind after the guns fell silent? In the final chapter, we uncover the lasting truth about the aircraft that reshaped the air war over Europe. By the time the war in Europe approached its final months, the effect of the Mustang was visible everywhere, on the ground, in the air, and in the statistics that told the grim story of the Luftwaffe's collapse. Mustang pilots were credited with destroying nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat and over 4,000 more on the ground. These weren't just numbers, they were the measurable steps that dismantled Germany's ability to fight in the sky. But the true legacy of the Mustang wasn't just in enemy aircraft destroyed. It was in what the fighter made possible. Before the Mustang entered the war, the entire concept of deep penetration strategic bombing was on the verge of collapse. Losses were unsustainable, crews were exhausted, and the death gap inside Germany seemed insurmountable. The Mustang closed that gap and with it reopened the path to the Allied strategy. Because bombers were now protected all the way to targets and back, their missions became far more effective. They struck oil plants, ball-bearing factories, aircraft production facilities, and rail hubs, crippling the machine that powered the Wehrmacht. Without the Mustang's range and persistence, these raids would have been suicide. With the Mustang, they became decisive blows that eroded Germany's industrial strength. The Mustang also changed air combat itself. It proved that a fighter didn't have to compromise between range, altitude performance, and maneuverability. Before the P-51, experts insisted that no aircraft could excel at all three simultaneously. Engineers shattered that belief by pairing one of the cleanest airframes ever built with one of the finest engines ever designed. The Merlin-Mustang combination rewrote the rules of fighter design. Today, Restored Mustangs fly in museums and airshows around the world. Their polished aluminum skins gleam in the sun, their engines crackle with unmistakable authority, and their presence evokes awe from enthusiasts who understand what they represent. These aircraft are more than machines. They're symbols of ingenuity, collaboration, and a turning point in the history of aerial warfare. Yet the Mustang's greatest lesson isn't about horsepower or firepower. It's about solving the right problem. American planners identified the weak point, escort range, and found a solution nobody expected. They didn't abandon strategic bombing. They innovated around it. The Mustang succeeded not because it was perfect from the start, but because engineers dared to rebuild it into what the war demanded. When Franz Stigler lined up behind that lone Mustang early in 1944, he was looking at a fighter his entire Air Force had underestimated. Within months, thousands like it would dominate the skies over Europe, hunt the Luftwaffe relentlessly, and help bring World War II closer to its conclusion. The aircraft mocked as mediocre became the weapon that broke Germany's air superiority. The P-51 Mustang remains, to this day, one of the most iconic symbols of American aviation, not because it was flawless from the beginning, but because it became the fighter that changed everything.